So there may be many specific problems or particular problems that we need to address, and we should be clear about what we want to achieve before we begin that survey so that we begin with the end in mind. And so we might be looking to adjust our pay levels to what our competitors are doing. We see that's happening a lot now with more national employers going to that $15 entry point, and others maybe looking and seeing whether they have to also meet that in order to be competitive for employees. But we might also be looking at the mix because it's not just the entry level that we're concerned about in pay policy, but how pay progresses over time. This is key to how we're going to retain and develop talent within our employee base. We might be looking at other specific problems like whether there is compression and whether employees who've been here longer aren't getting paid substantially higher than new employees, or we might be looking for some form of inequity between different groups by looking at the data. So there's a lot of different purposes that we might have in mind, but again, we need to be clear about that because doing a salary survey, getting this external data, it takes time and it requires resources, other financial resources, and so we want to get it right from the outset. Now, as we've addressed, we need to understand how pay is going to progress as employees progress through their careers with the organization. And we have to consider how pay is dynamic and may change over time based on things in the external marketplace. And so organizations need to be prepared to regularly adjust pay levels. There is, movement in terms of pay rates in competing for applicants just based on inflation alone. But also, we can look at other factors that influence the marketplace, like the performance of the organization and its ability to pay. That can certainly influence whether they're going to retain employees. And also, if it's in a union environment, if there are specified terms in the contract for how pay should progress. Now, when we're talking about pay mix, we're talking about more of the structure, the differences between how much one job is paid versus another job is paid. So what are those differences in compensation? Now, typically, we're not addressing that as often as we are pay level. And it's not necessarily clear why this is happening. It's interesting. We brought up the issue of compression, and in many ways, compression, meaning that the value of those employees who've worked longer at the organization does not match the marketplace as well as new employees, and therefore they're not being paid relatively as well as new employees. That is an issue, I think, largely because of the neglect of looking at the pay mix. And it may be actually rational in some ways on the part of organizations to neglect this because when a person is employed, there is this dependency that they have and this unlikelihood that they're going to move to another organization for a small amount of pay. But that can accumulate over time and it can really result in some performance based inequities that can be detrimental to the organization. Now, I will say it may depend on the particular organization. I've worked in more unionized settings, and I think this idea of pay mix often comes up, and there's often this adjustment in pay that's done, but that is something that's typically negotiated by the union. And I think if there's not that pressure, then often that again might be neglected, and ultimately it's not good for the organization. So perhaps we, as leaders of HR, should be focusing more proactively on pay mix. Now, the structure you really looked at, looking at those internal factors of pay and doing job evaluation. When we are making decisions about structure, we're really using a combination of that internal, rational, judgmental approach based on subject matter experts and looking then at the market and what the market is telling us in terms of how pay should be structured. And by using those different analytic approaches in combination, we think we're creating a fairer and more sustainable pay structure. And in fact, oftentimes the differences between what the market data is telling us and what the more judgmental job evaluation data is telling us is very important for us. It tells us about what's happening in the organization, and sometimes there's reasons why we are different from the market, and then there's other ways where the market helps us to identify shortcomings in our conceptualization of the marketplace of labor. There are those who will just go straight to the market data and say this is how we should peg our pay. But I think there's a strong amount of thinking that taking the job evaluation data, the rational approach to valuing jobs and comparing it to the market data and integrating those sources of data can be very important. What is that marketplace we're looking at? Who are the competitors? And so we want to know, what occupations are we looking at? Sometimes job titles and occupations are changing very quickly, so we need to sometimes drill down and look more at the skills or competencies that we're going to be hiring for and who is competing for those skills and competencies. Certainly, geographic area is another big factor as we addressed that you can get region specific information. And then we want to look at the products and services that we're offering as an organization, and that will inform us as to who our competitors are. We want the data to be valid, and so which jobs we're choosing is an important question there. Is there a real comparability between the jobs in our organization and those that we're looking at in this survey? And so we want to be careful about benchmarking those jobs and assessing how much they are connected. Now, sometimes there are issues of the data fitting, and there's different options we have. One approach is to break down the job into competencies and look at the jobs in the marketplace in terms of their competencies and try to find connections there. So we've been talking a lot about data, so that means statistical analysis. And when we are dealing with consultants, they will do much of the reporting and analysis for us. But we need to be able to still work with the data, to understand the data, to explain the data to others. Fortunately, that's the type of thing that we learn about. We've talked about concepts like this in our class on performance management and human resource analytics, and talked about other statistical concepts and others. So these are things again that we don't learn for one class and then conveniently forget the rest of our lives. These are things that to be a leader in HR, you need these competencies. And so for instance, understanding a frequency distribution is key to understanding compensation because that's the distribution of salaries. And it's a way of looking at it and in one graph seeing the levels and mix of compensation all in one graph. So it's really great. Now, of course, we're often dealing with a large number of people, a large number of data points, and so we need to be able to summarize those in more summary descriptive statistics. So measures of central tendency are important. Now, which you use can be critical, and it often depends on the frequency distribution that you're using. If you've got a normal distribution, that bell curve that we expect to see, then the mean is an appropriate summary statistic of central tendency. It's going to be that point which best represents the distribution. However, oftentimes we don't have a normal distribution when we're looking at compensation data. If you look at the graphs, the frequency distributions in the textbook, you'll see some of them really look quite skewed. That means that there's a long tail that goes on longer on one side than the other. And it's not like there is a bell shaped to it. It's a very crooked bell. Uh, and and so in those circumstances, again, we often have what's called a positive skew. And that means that we have some outliers of high paid people. Usually they're, a few employees who are critical to the organization but tend to be paid a little higher. And that causes that distribution to be non-normal. And so we need oftentimes to use a different measure of central tendency when we've got that skewed distribution. The median, the 50th percentile, is a better measure uh, of central tendency. Of course, we're often looking at the spread of salaries, and so there we're going to look at statistics like the standard deviation that tell us a spread. Now, ultimately, what the most important type of statistical analysis is more of a regression or a correlational analysis where we're creating that market line. And so we look at benchmark jobs, and we look at the information on competitors and how they're spread out around those benchmarks. Some of our competitors are going to be paying these benchmark jobs higher, some lower, and we're looking for a line of best fit that we can determine statistically through the process of regression. That's the line of best fit. That's the slope that we learned about way back in algebra, and it's that line that we've seen when we've looked at statistics, when we've looked at graphs representing correlation, the association between things. Regression is very closely connected to correlation. The data is largely going to determine how good of a line we get in terms of representing that data. The more data that we have, the easier it is to form a line of best fit. When we're dealing with a small amount of data, a small amount of comparisons in the marketplace, it's not going to look very much like a line, and we're going to see large deviations away from that line. So the amount of data that we have can influence how good our statistical analysis are for decision making. And here is an example of that line of best fit. We've got the benchmark jobs along the x-axis, and then we've got the base pay along the y-axis. And we can see that there is a fairly good kind of linear form here, and so presumably we're dealing with a good amount of representative data. Talked about how we're using job evaluation and market pricing in conjunction. The primary way we're doing that is with those jobs that are non-benchmark jobs, that we don't necessarily have marketplace data on. But if we have comparisons between those non-benchmark jobs and our benchmark jobs in terms of compensable factors and in terms of job evaluation information, then we can make inferences about how to pay those jobs based on both the market information of the benchmark jobs and the information we have from job evaluation. We need to understand, though, that there is to some degree always some judgmental element there. There is not one grand equation. This is the way that you're going to determine the pay for jobs in every organization. It's going to differ. Again, it must differ based on the strategy of the organization. And it's going to differ based on a lot of other factors, like how common that job is and how competitive the marketplace is. So many different factors. So there are some very good methods for us to use both for job evaluation and for salary surveys. But the final decisions of how to use that data are typically done within the organization, and there isn't just one perfect way of doing it. There's going